My name is Brian Lawson. I'm in my late 30s, and for most of my adult life, I've worked inside large organizations, places with glass walls, quiet hallways, and a language that sounds collaborative but often isn't. I've been a project analyst, a strategist, a fixer. Titles changed. The pattern didn't. People usually read me the same way. Calm, measured, not loud, not threatening. The kind of person who listens more than he speaks, who takes notes while others take credit. If you asked my co-workers how they'd describe me back then, most would say reliable. A few might say solid. Almost none would say influential. And that's kind of the point. This story isn't about a sudden explosion or a dramatic takedown. It's about what happens when blame travels faster than truth, and what it feels like to watch your reputation collapse in real time, while the people who could correct it choose silence. It's about a boardroom, a project I didn't lead, and a moment when my name was used as a convenient landing place for failure. I want to be clear about something from the start. This isn't a revenge story. There's no shouting, no public humiliation, no viral moment where everyone claps. What happened unfolded slowly, quietly, and mostly out of sight. And when it ended, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like clarity. Over the next parts, I'll walk you through how I became invisible in plain sight, how small dismissals normalized something far more dangerous, and how silence, first forced on me, then chosen by me, became the most misunderstood part of this entire story. You'll hear about the day something shifted internally, long before anything changed on the surface. About preparation that looked like passivity, about leverage discovered without celebration, and about the consequences that arrived without announcement. There are no villains twirling moustaches here, just people protecting themselves, systems rewarding convenience, and one moment where accountability needed a name, and mine was available. I'll tell you what it felt like to sit there, to not interrupt, to not defend myself, and to let the record stay wrong longer than anyone thought was wise. I'm telling this now not to rewrite history, but to tell it honestly. Because many of you have probably been in rooms like that, maybe not a boardroom, maybe not with that title, but a moment where you realized how quickly narratives form, and how rarely they're corrected unless it's convenient. So before we go any further, I want to ask you something, genuinely. Have you ever stayed quiet in a moment where speaking up felt necessary, not because you were weak, but because you sensed that silence would reveal more than words ever could? Before anything went wrong, before meetings became tense and names started carrying weight they hadn't earned, I was easy to place. Not important enough to challenge, not insignificant enough to ignore completely. I existed in that comfortable middle space organizations create for people who make things run without ever becoming the story. I was the guy people looped in late, the one copied on emails for visibility. I was invited to meetings not to speak, but to remember, to take notes, to clarify later. When someone asked, "Can you just sanity check this?" they were usually talking to me. And I did, quietly, thoroughly, reliably. What I wasn't was political. I didn't cultivate proximity to power. I didn't linger after meetings or position myself near the loudest voice in the room. I believed, naively maybe, that consistency would speak for itself. That accuracy mattered more than optics. That if you did the work well enough, the work would protect you. People mistook my calm for agreement, my silence for compliance, my lack of interruption due to a lack of opinion. In reality, I had opinions. I just didn't broadcast them unless they were asked for. And most of the time, they weren't. In performance reviews, I was described with words like dependable, steady, and low friction. No one ever said indispensable. No one said leader either. I didn't push back on that. I thought it was fine. Safer, even. When projects succeeded, the spotlight went elsewhere. When they stalled, I was asked to help unblock things. When they failed, I was close enough to be associated, but not close enough to have authority. That distinction would matter later. I just didn't know it yet. In meetings with executives, I sat slightly off to the side, laptop open, pen ready. I noticed patterns others didn't seem to care about. Who deferred to whom? Which questions never got answered? Which decisions were framed as collective even when they weren't? I kept track of timelines, of approvals, of those who signed off and when. Not because I was suspicious, because that was my job. If someone had asked me then how I thought I was perceived, I would have said, useful, safe, replaceable, but not urgently so. I didn't think anyone disliked me. I also didn't think anyone would defend me if it became inconvenient. That's the strange thing about being invisible without being ignored. You're seen just enough to be involved, but not enough to be protected. You absorb responsibility without authority, context without voice. I told myself that was maturity, professionalism, that staying measured was a strength, and for a long time it was, until it wasn't. There were moments, small ones, where I noticed how easily my contributions were paraphrased by others, then repeated louder. How ideas I'd sent in writing resurfaced verbally under different names. I noticed, but I didn't correct the record. It didn't feel worth it. I didn't want to be that person. The one who says, actually, hush. That was my idea. I thought dignity lived in restraint, and to be fair, nothing felt hostile. Nothing felt personal. It was all very reasonable. Very professional. That's what made it dangerous. Because when things are framed as neutral, you don't prepare for blame. You prepare for more work. So when I think back to who I was to them, I don't see a victim. I see someone who believed the system rewarded fairness by default. Someone who underestimated how quickly narratives harden when silence leaves space to fill. I was there. I was present. I was documented in the margins. And at the time, I thought that was enough. The first time it happened, it was small enough to dismiss. That's why it worked. It was during a mid-quarter review, the kind that exists less to solve problems and more to reassure leadership that problems are being tracked. I wasn't leading the project in question. I never had. My role was advisory, risk analysis, dependency mapping, and decision documentation. Clear, defined, on paper. At some point, a timeline slipped. Not catastrophically, just enough to trigger concern. The room shifted in that subtle way it does when people start looking for a reason that sounds contained. My manager cleared his throat and said my name, not accusingly, casually, almost kindly. He said something like, "Brian's been close to this work stream, so maybe he can give some context on why we're behind." That sentence mattered, not because it was false, but because it was imprecise. Close to sounds like ownership when you're not paying attention. Context sounds like an explanation when what's being asked for is justification. I clarified. Gently. I said I wasn't the decision owner. My involvement was limited to analysis. The delay came after a scope change approved 2 levels above my pay grade. No one reacted, not negatively, just nothing. The meeting moved on. Afterward, a colleague told me, "Don't worry about it. That was nothing." And maybe it was, but something about it stayed with me. Not the words themselves, but how easily the framing slipped. How quickly could responsibility be implied without being assigned? A week later, in a different meeting, the same project came up again. This time, the language shifted further. Someone said, "When Brian's team was working through this," and I almost interrupted, almost. But I didn't have a team, and no one corrected it, including me. I told myself it didn't matter. That everyone knew what I actually did. That the record would speak for itself if it ever needed to. I trusted the documents, the approvals, the emails. I trusted that accuracy had gravity. What I didn't account for was repetition. Once a framing enters a room and goes unchallenged, it starts to feel familiar. Familiar becomes accepted. Accepted becomes assumed. The cut wasn't the misattribution, it was the normalization of it. I started noticing how my name was used when conversations needed a technical anchor. "Let's ask Brian. Brian can probably explain." Explanation slowly replaced contribution. Contribution slowly replaced ownership. Ownership, even implied, is a dangerous thing when outcomes turn. Still, I stayed quiet. Correcting people felt petty, defensive. I didn't want to seem territorial. I didn't want to look like I was distancing myself from work when things got difficult. That's how it would have looked, I told myself. So I absorbed it, and in doing so, I helped build a version of myself that didn't exist, but would soon be very useful to someone else. I didn't know it yet, but that first small cut wasn't an accident. It was a test, not of competence, but of resistance. And I failed it by being reasonable. Once something happens twice, it stops feeling like a mistake. It becomes a pattern you either challenge or adapt to. And I adapted. The misattributions didn't escalate dramatically. They softened, spread out, became part of the background noise. My name appeared in summaries where it didn't belong. My role was described more broadly than it actually was. And every time, it was just close enough to plausible that correcting it felt unnecessary. So I didn't. I told myself I was choosing professionalism over ego. That clarity would emerge when it mattered, that I didn't need to guard every sentence like a contract. I was wrong about one thing in particular. I assumed intent mattered more than outcome. Meetings started to blur together. In each one, I played the same part, listening, clarifying when asked, sending follow-ups afterward. I became the person who had the details, which sounds flattering, until you realize it also makes you the default explanation for things that go wrong. I noticed how others spoke about risk versus decision. They used "we" when discussing approvals and specific names when discussing execution. And somehow, I kept landing in the second category. At one point, a director referenced Brian's approach when discussing a strategy I had explicitly cautioned against. I had the email. I had the timestamp. I had recommended the opposite. But correcting that in front of everyone would have required a shift in tone I wasn't ready to make. So I stayed quiet. That silence did something subtle. It validated the rewrite. I started rationalizing it in ways that now sound painfully familiar. This isn't the hill to die on. Everyone knows how these things work. Speaking up would only make things awkward. And it's true. Nothing bad happened immediately. In fact, my reputation stayed intact on the surface. I was still seen as capable, trustworthy, calm under pressure. But underneath that was a slow erosion of authorship, of agency. The disrespect wasn't loud. That's why it was effective. It didn't provoke. It didn't insult. It is simply assumed. And assumptions, left unchallenged, become memory. I began to sense that I was being placed into a role without being asked. The reliable absorber, the technical conscience, the person whose presence allowed others to move fast without worrying about consequences. And when consequences did appear, there I was, adjacent enough to be referenced. Still, I didn't push back. Part of me believed that staying agreeable kept me safe, that visibility only invited scrutiny, that if I just kept my head down, the truth would eventually settle where it belonged. What I didn't see was that by normalizing small distortions, I was teaching people what I would tolerate, and what you tolerate becomes your boundary. By the time I realized that, the story others told about my role had already moved a few steps away from reality. Not enough to trigger an alarm, just enough to be useful, and I was the only one who noticed. It wasn't announced. No one sat me down and explained it, but at some point, I understood the role I had been assigned, quietly, collectively, without my consent. I was the constant, not the leader, not the decision-maker, the constant presence that made everything feel stable. I was looped into initiatives early, not to shape direction, but to ensure continuity. I carried context across teams. I remembered why certain paths were chosen. I filled gaps when others moved on to louder, more visible work. From the outside, it looked like trust. From the inside, it felt like containment. People leaned on me to make things smoother, not better, to translate between departments, to explain why a compromise had been necessary. I became the person who could be counted on to say, "That makes sense," even when it didn't. And because I rarely challenged things publicly, I was safe to be involved. I wouldn't escalate. I wouldn't embarrass anyone. I wouldn't force accountability in real time. That made me useful, reliable, useful, invisible. The more I fulfilled that role, the more it solidified. I was no longer just participating. I was maintaining, preserving momentum, absorbing friction so others could move quickly. There's a kind of respect that comes with that. But it's not the kind that protects you when outcomes turn negative. I noticed that when leadership talked about ownership, they used it aspirationally. When they talked about execution, they used names. And mine started to appear there more often. Not because I was leading, but because I was present, because I had the context, because I didn't object. I began to understand something uncomfortable. My silence wasn't neutral, it was functional. By not correcting the record, I made it easier for others to simplify narratives. And simplified narratives need placeholders. They need faces. I told myself I was choosing stability over conflict, that stepping outside this role would be disruptive, that someone had to hold the threads together, and that someone, apparently, was me. What I didn't realize yet was how difficult it is to step out of a role once others rely on you to play it. Especially when that role involves absorbing blame quietly. I wasn't angry. Not yet. Mostly, I was tired. Tired of carrying things that weren't mine. Tired of being assigned responsibility without authority. Tired of explaining decisions I hadn't made, but I still believed things were fundamentally fair. That there was a line people wouldn't cross. that no one would outright assign fault where it clearly didn't belong. I hadn't seen the meeting yet, the one where that assumption would collapse. The shift didn't happen in a dramatic moment. There was no confrontation, no raised voices, no instant clarity. It happened quietly, almost invisibly, in the space between what was said and what was allowed to stand. It was late afternoon, one of those meetings that felt heavier than it needed to be. Senior leadership, a few directors, my manager and I. The agenda looked routine, a review, a recalibration, words that suggest adjustment, not reckoning. Then a question came up about a decision made months earlier. A decision I had advised against. A decision that had been documented, approved, and moved forward anyway. My manager spoke first. He framed the decision as a collective call, then pivoted. He said something like, "At the execution level, Brian was closest to this, so responsibility sat there." The room didn't react. No one challenged it. No one asked for clarification. And in that silence, something in me changed. Not anger, not panic. Just a sudden, sharp awareness. I understood in that moment that the system I trusted would not self-correct. That accuracy did not have gravity unless someone applied force to it. And that I had been mistaken for thinking fairness was passive. I could have spoken. I could have corrected the timeline. I could have pointed to the documentation. I could have said calmly that I was not the owner. The decision had been escalated and approved above me. I didn't, not because I froze, but because I saw clearly what would happen if I did. It wouldn't fix anything. It would shift discomfort onto me. It would make me look defensive. It would introduce tension into a room that valued smoothness over truth. And most importantly, it would signal that I was still playing the same role. Explaining, absorbing, making it easier for everyone else to move on. So I stayed quiet. But this time the silence was different. It wasn't a resignation, it was an observation. I watched how easily the narrative settled, how quickly the room accepted a version of events that simplified responsibility. I watched who avoided eye contact, who nodded, who stayed neutral. I noticed who could have intervened and didn't. And I understood something else too. Silence wasn't just something imposed on me anymore. It was a choice. That realization didn't make me feel powerful. It made me feel awake. I left that meeting knowing one thing for certain. I would never again assume that truth alone was enough. From that moment on, if I stayed quiet, it would be intentional, strategic, temporary. The shift wasn't visible to anyone else, but it was irreversible for me. After that meeting, nothing changed on the surface. I showed up the same way. Same tone, same posture, same measured responses. If anything, I became quieter. E.g. action. And people misread that immediately. They assumed I had accepted the framing, that I had internalized the blame, that I was retreating. A few colleagues checked in with polite concern. "You doing okay?" That was a tough discussion. I thanked them and moved on. What they didn't see was that my silence had shifted from habit to strategy. I stopped volunteering in clarification unless it was requested in writing. I stopped correcting language in real time. I started documenting more carefully, not defensively, but deliberately. I tracked how decisions were described versus how they were made, who used collective language when it helped them, who used specific names when it didn't. I didn't confront anyone. I didn't escalate. I didn't hint that I was preparing anything. That would have been counterproductive. Instead, I paid attention. Silence has a strange effect on people who are used to you filling gaps. Meetings felt slightly less smooth. Questions hung longer. Follow-ups took more effort. I noticed small signs of discomfort, but nothing anyone could point to. They mistook my restraint for compliance, and that misinterpretation gave me space. I began to understand how much of my value had been in cushioning others from consequence. By stepping back just enough, I let systems reveal themselves. I let inconsistencies surface. I let ownership become visible by its absence. There was no satisfaction in this, no sense of superiority, just clarity. I realized that if I spoke too soon, I'd be pulled back into the same role. The fixer, the explainer, the stabilizer, and nothing would change. So I waited, not passively, intentionally. While everything looked the same from the outside, something else was happening underneath. Quietly, methodically, and completely unnoticed. I had always kept records. That was part of my job. But now, I have begun organizing them differently. Not just chronologically, but narratively. I traced how decisions evolved from discussion to approval to execution. I mapped language changes, how we considered became Brian handled, how caution became alignment, I wasn't building a case. I was building understanding. I revisited old emails, meeting notes, slide decks, approval threads. I didn't cherry pick. I looked at everything. I wanted to see the system as it actually functioned, not as it claimed to. What emerged was unsettling, but not surprising. Responsibility flowed downward. Credit flowed upward. And in between, people like me acted as buffers. We absorbed complexity so others could present simplicity. I also noticed something else. The people who stayed silent in that meeting weren't malicious. They were careful. Correcting the narrative would have required effort, risk, alignment against someone higher up. Silence was the easier option. Understanding that changed how I felt. It wasn't personal, it was structural, and that meant it was predictable. I began preparing, not for confrontation, but for independence. I documented my actual role clearly. I clarified boundaries in writing. I stopped accepting vague ownership. I asked neutral questions that forced specificity. Who was accountable? Who was approving? Who was deciding? Each question seemed harmless. But together, they shifted the paper trail. No one noticed because nothing felt urgent. I wasn't challenging authority. I wasn't accusing anyone. I was just precise. And precision is disruptive in systems built on ambiguity. I also started exploring options outside the organization. Not impulsively, quietly. Conversations, possibilities. Not because I wanted to leave immediately, but because I wanted leverage that didn't depend on internal validation. What they never noticed was that I had stopped trying to be understood by the room. I was preparing to be understood by the record, and that record, once complete, would speak far more clearly than I ever could in a meeting. The realization didn't arrive as a rush. There was no moment of triumph, no surge of adrenaline, just a quiet, settling clarity. I saw it one evening while reviewing a sequence of approvals. 3 decisions, same project, same risk, 3 different narratives, depending on who was speaking. Individually, each made sense. Collectively, they contradicted each other, and in the center of that contradiction was me. Not as the decision-maker, but as the narrative anchor. The name that allowed responsibility to feel assigned without being accurate. That was the reveal. I hadn't been blamed because I failed. I had been blamed because I was available, documented, and non-confrontational. I made the story coherent without making it true. Understanding that changed everything, not emotionally, strategically. I didn't feel anger. I felt relief. Because if the problem was structural, it wasn't a reflection of my worth or competence. It was a function of positioning, and positioning can be changed. I also realized something else. The documentation wasn't just defensive, it was leverage. Not in a threatening way, in a clarifying one. It showed patterns, it showed escalation paths, it showed that accountability had been rerouted after the fact. I didn't show this to anyone. Not yet. I didn't hint at it. I didn't even talk about it. I just knew. And once you know, you don't rush, you choose. The choice wasn't about exposing anyone. It was about deciding what kind of ending this story would have. Loud or quiet, immediate or inevitable. I chose inevitable. Once the picture was clear, I reached a point I couldn't avoid. I had options. Real ones. And each came with consequences. I could confront my manager directly, lay out the documentation, correct the narrative. That would create tension, but it might restore accuracy, temporarily. It would also mark me as difficult, someone who kept receipts, someone who disrupted smooth stories. I could escalate. Bring the record to leadership, force a correction. That would likely work on paper, but it would fracture trust. And in organizations like this, trust once broken doesn't heal cleanly, it just relocates. Or I could do nothing. Continue absorbing the role. Let the narrative harden. Stay employed. Stay useful. Stay small. That option scared me the most, because I knew where it led. So I chose a 4th option, the one that didn't require permission. I decided to remove myself from the narrative entirely, not abruptly, not emotionally, but decisively. That meant preparing for a future where my credibility didn't depend on people who benefited from my silence. It meant building an exit that didn't look like a protest, but like progression. I didn't announce this decision. I didn't share it. I just committed to it privately. Once that choice was made, everything else became simpler, not easier, but clearer. What people often misunderstand about silence is that they assume it means waiting. What I was doing wasn't waiting. It was repositioning. From the outside, my days looked identical. Same calendar density, same neutral tone in meetings, same habit of following up with summaries and action items. If anyone had been asked whether I seemed disengaged, they would have said no. If anything, I appeared steadier than before. That steadiness was deliberate. I knew that any visible shift, less responsiveness, sharper boundaries, emotional distance, would be interpreted as a reaction. And reaction invites scrutiny. Scrutiny invites questions. Questions pull you back into narratives you're trying to exit. So I stayed boring. But beneath that surface, everything changed. The first thing I stopped doing was absorbing ambiguity. Whenever someone said, "Can you just take this and run with it?" I replied with something precise and unthreatening. "Happy to help. Can you clarify whether this is advisory or execution ownership?" That one sentence did more than any confrontation ever could. Sometimes the response came quickly. Sometimes it didn't come at all. And when it didn't, I didn't chase it. I let the silence sit where it belonged. I also stopped translating for people. Before, I had made a habit of smoothing communication between teams, rewriting unclear asks, reframing vague direction into actionable steps, interpreting half decisions as full ones so work could move forward. It made me valuable. It also made me invisible. Now, when instructions were unclear, I reflected them back as is, calmly, respectfully, without adding interpretation. "What I'm hearing is X. Let me know if that's accurate before I proceed." This had a subtle effect. Meetings got longer, follow-ups multiplied, decisions took effort. None of that was my fault, but I had been preventing it for years. By stepping back just enough, I let people feel the friction I had been absorbing. At the same time, I became meticulous about boundaries. Not defensive, documented. If I were advisory, I would write advisory. If I were consulted, I would write consulted. If I weren't the owner, I wouldn't let language suggest otherwise. No accusations. No tone, just clarity. It's remarkable how destabilizing clarity can be in environments built on the flexibility of blame. I also began to disengage emotionally in a very specific way. Not by caring less, but by caring differently. Before, I cared about outcomes, about making sure things worked, even if I had no authority to influence key decisions. Now, I care about alignment between responsibility and control. If those didn't match, I didn't overextend. This wasn't negligence. It was discipline. I still did my job well, but I stopped compensating for structural flaws with personal effort. Parallel to all of this, I was building something entirely separate, quietly, patiently. Without anyone at work knowing, I reached out to former colleagues, industry contacts, people who had seen my work outside this environment. I didn't lead with frustration. I didn't tell stories. I asked questions. I listened. I explored. Conversations turned into opportunities, not because I pushed, but because I finally allowed my experience to be framed accurately. Outside the organization, I wasn't the quiet phi. I was the strategist who understood systems end to end. The person who could see failure coming early. The one who knew how decisions actually traveled. It was strange, almost disorienting, to be seen clearly elsewhere while being misseen where I currently stood. That contrast removed my doubt. I took my time evaluating options. I wasn't looking for escape. I was looking for alignment. Somewhere, my restraint would be read as judgment, not weakness. Somewhere, documentation was respected, not exploited. Somewhere, silence was chosen, not assigned. When an offer finally came together, it felt calm. Not euphoric, not triumphant, just right. I didn't negotiate aggressively. I didn't posture. I didn't need to. I knew what I was bringing, and I knew what I was leaving behind. Still, I didn't rush my departure. I waited until the internal conditions were stable enough that my absence would matter, but not so chaotic that it would look retaliatory. Timing matters when you're exiting quietly. Leave too early, and no one notices. Leave too late, and you're blamed for the collapse. When the moment came, I scheduled the conversation with my manager like any other update. No build-up, no warning. I told him I'd accepted another role, that it aligned better with my long-term direction, that I'd support a smooth transition. He looked surprised. Genuinely. There was a pause, just long enough to register recalculation. He said something polite, congratulatory. Asked if there was anything they could do to keep me. I said no. Not because there wasn't, but because I knew the cost of staying. I didn't mention the board meeting. I didn't mention the narrative. I didn't mention the documentation. I didn't need to. I gave notice. I documented handoffs. I wrapped things cleanly. No loose ends, no scorched earth. And still, no one panicked. At first, colleagues expressed mild concern. Big loss. You'll be missed. But nothing urgent, nothing revealing. They assumed someone else would absorb what I did, because that's what had always happened. What they didn't understand yet was that I hadn't just been doing tasks, I had been maintaining coherence. I had been carrying institutional memory that wasn't written anywhere officially. I had been smoothing over contradictions that would soon be visible. And now, quietly, I was stepping away from all of it. No announcement, no confrontation, no final correction of the record. Just absence. And absence, unlike argument, cannot be debated away. The first consequences didn't look like consequences at all. They looked like an inconvenience. A meeting got rescheduled because the agenda wasn't clear. A deck went out with 3 versions of the same assumption. An approval was stalled because no one could remember why a certain constraint existed in the first place. Small things. Manageable things. At first, people assumed this was just transition noise. The normal friction that follows any departure. Someone would get up to speed. Someone would own the context. Someone always did. Except this time, no one quite could. Because what I had been carrying wasn't a task list, it was continuity. I remembered which compromises were temporary and which were permanent, which risks had been accepted knowingly, and which had just been deferred. I knew which decisions had been political and which had been technical, and why they'd been framed differently afterward. That knowledge wasn't dramatic, it was invisible until it was gone. A week after I left, someone reached out with a question. Casual, friendly. "Hey, quick check. Do you remember why we decided to go with option B instead of A?" I answered politely, briefly, with what I could recall. But I didn't reconstruct the entire backstory the way I used to. I didn't translate. I didn't contextualize beyond the facts. More messages followed, from different people, different teams, all circling the same issue. The record existed, but the reasoning didn't feel complete anymore. That's when discomfort started to surface. Meetings became longer, not because people talked more, but because they hesitated. They relitigated decisions that had already been made. They debated risks I had already mapped. They rediscovered constraints that had been quietly managed for months. And slowly, something else happened. The narrative lost cohesion. Without me present to answer questions, the simplified story that I had been close to execution stopped being useful. Because execution without context leads nowhere. People needed to know who had decided, when, and why. And suddenly, those answers weren't easy to produce. I heard about this secondhand at first. A former colleague mentioned that leadership was revisiting assumptions. Another said there was confusion about ownership on a work stream I'd been adjacent to. No one mentioned my name explicitly. They didn't have to. The consequences weren't punitive. They were structural. Accountability started drifting upward again, not by intention, but by necessity. When no one could confidently explain a decision, leaders had to engage. When risks weren't pre-digested, directors had to slow down. When language got fuzzy, someone had to clarify it in real time. The buffer was gone. That absence revealed how much pressure I'd been quietly managed, and it revealed something else too. How exposed certain people were without a neutral party absorbing ambiguity for them. Them. There was a moment, relayed to me later, where a leader asked, "Who actually signed off on this?" And no one answered immediately. That pause mattered. Because pauses create space, and space invites scrutiny. Suddenly, old emails were being pulled, old approvals revisited, not to assign blame, but to regain control. And in doing so, the narrative began to shift, not dramatically, not publicly, but unmistakably. What had once been framed as execution gaps now looked like decision gaps. What had been attributed to follow-through now looked like governance. And I wasn't there to soften that realization. I didn't intervene. I didn't correct anyone. I didn't send clarifying notes. I let the system experience itself without my mediation. Some people grew anxious, others defensive. A few grew quieter than usual. No one accused me of anything. Not because they felt guilty, but because my absence made the accusation impractical. ICOL. You can't assign blame to someone who isn't present to carry it. Instead, responsibility began to redistribute itself naturally, unevenly, uncomfortably, but honestly. I heard later that someone asked why I'd never pushed back more. Why hadn't I corrected the record earlier? Why did I stay so composed? The answer was simple, though I never gave it. Because correcting the record while you're inside the system just creates friction. Letting the system confront itself creates consequences. And those consequences had only just begun. By the time people realized something was wrong, they no longer agreed on what was wrong. That was the point of no return. At first, Leadership framed the growing confusion as a coordination issue, then as a communication breakdown, then as a resourcing gap. Each explanation sounded reasonable in isolation. Together, they conflicted. CTED. Meetings multiplied. Syncs were added to calendars that were already full. People came prepared with slides, but the slides didn't agree with each other. Timelines overlapped in ways that didn't make sense. Dependencies were referenced, but no one could say who had approved them or why. What had once been a clean, simplified story had fractured into fragments. That's when urgency entered the room. Not panic yet, but tension. The kind that shows up as clipped questions and forced optimism. Leaders began asking for alignment more frequently. Directors used phrases like reset expectations and clarify accountability. Those words are always a sign that something fundamental has slipped. I heard about this through quiet channels. Former colleagues, friendly check-ins that carried more weight than their words suggested. They asked how I was settling in, whether I missed the team, whether I might be open to consulting just temporarily to help bridge gaps. I declined politely, not out of spite, but because stepping back in would have restored the old equilibrium. I would have become the translator again. The absorber, the person who made contradictions manageable. And the system didn't need management anymore. It needed exposure. Inside the organization, something else was happening. The narrative that had once protected people by simplifying responsibility was now working against them. Because when outcomes worsened, there was no longer a single convenient place to point. The question shifted from who handled this to who decided this. That shift changes everything. People who had stayed silent before began speaking, but cautiously. Not to accuse, but to clarify. And clarification, when delayed, feels like an accusation anyway. Old approval chains were revisited, not aggressively, carefully. Emails were reread, language passed. The same documentation I had once trusted implicitly was now being scrutinized by people who had previously skimmed it. And in that scrutiny, something uncomfortable emerged. The story they had relied on, that I had been responsible at the execution level, no longer aligned with the evidence. The timelines didn't match. The approvals didn't originate where they were assumed to. The cautions I had raised, once ignored, were now visible. No one announced this realization. It didn't need to be announced. You can feel it when a room stops pretending. That's when the tone changed. Meetings became defensive. People started preemptively clarifying their roles. Just to be clear, this wasn't my call. For context, this was already in motion when I joined. We were following directions. Language hardened around self-protection. And still, no one reached out to correct the record publicly, because by then it was too late. Correcting it would have required admitting that the narrative had been wrong from the beginning. That blame had been misplaced. That silence had been convenient. And convenience, once exposed, turns into liability. I was told that my manager became unusually quiet in meetings, that he asked fewer questions, that he deferred more often. Not because he had lost confidence, but because he had lost certainty. Certainty depends on clean stories, and the story was no longer clean. At one point, leadership asked for a retrospective. Not the performative kind, but a real one. A timeline, a decision log, a risk review. They wanted to understand how things had unfolded so differently from expectations. That request sent a ripple through the organization, because a real retrospective doesn't just look at outcomes, it looks at responsibility. People scrambled, not chaotically, but purposefully. Documents were assembled, narratives refined, language softened. But the record had a stubborn quality. It didn't bend easily, and I wasn't there to smooth it. I heard that someone suggested bringing me in to help Clary. The idea was discussed seriously. Loosely. It was rejected. Not because they didn't need clarity, but because my presence would have made the imbalance undeniable. It would have forced a comparison between how things had been described and how they had actually occurred. That kind of clarity, once someone has already been blamed, is dangerous. So instead, they tried to fix it internally. They reassigned ownership. They restructured teams. They introduced new checkpoints. They talked about lessons learned. But none of that addressed the underlying issue, because the problem wasn't the process, it was narrative. And narratives don't reset cleanly once they've collapsed. People began to sense that something had gone wrong long before I left, that my departure hadn't caused the failure. It had revealed it. That I hadn't been the source of instability, but the thing that had been holding instability together. That realization produced something close to panic. Not loud panic, Quiet panic. The kind where people double-check their words. Where emails get longer. Where meetings end without decisions. Where everyone is careful, but no one is confident. Too many hands on the wheel. No one was certain which direction was safe. That's when regret surfaced. Not moral regret. Practical regret. I was told that someone said, we should have listened more when Brian flagged those risks. Another responded, he never pushed back that hard. Both statements were true, and both missed the point. I hadn't pushed because pushing would have been absorbed, reframed, neutralized. I hadn't escalated because escalation would have turned me into the problem. The system had taught me that, and now the system was confronting the cost of that lesson. By the time anyone considered reaching out directly, not for help, but for explanation, it was clear that whatever could have been fixed earlier could no longer be reversed. Trust had shifted, roles had changed, perceptions had realigned. You can correct a mistake early. You can even recover from misjudgment. But once a narrative collapses under its own weight, all you can do is adapt to the damage. And adaptation always reveals who was insulated and who was exposed. I didn't feel satisfaction hearing any of this. Mostly, I felt distance. Not emotional distance, temporal distance. Like watching weather move across a landscape you've already left. I had stepped out of the storm before it named itself. And by the time anyone realized what they had lost, not just a person, but a stabilizing force, it was far too late to fix it. The conversation didn't happen the way people imagine confrontation. There was no dramatic summons, no urgent calendar invite with a vague subject line. No build-up. It happened months later, quietly, because it had to. By then, I was settled into my new role. Different organization, different rhythm. My days were calmer, not because the work was easier, but because responsibility and authority finally aligned. Decisions were named, risks were owned. Silence meant thought, not avoidance. One afternoon, I received a message from my former manager, polite, careful. He asked if I'd be open to a short call. Just to reconnect, he said. No urgency. No context. I agreed. When we spoke, his tone was measured, familiar. But something underneath it had shifted. He wasn't calling as a superior anymore. He wasn't even calling as a peer. He was calling as someone who had lost certainty. We talked about neutral things first. My transition, his workload, the organization. He mentioned how complex things had become since I left. How difficult it was to keep track of decisions now that teams had changed. Then he paused, and finally, he said it. He said, I've been thinking a lot about that board meeting. Not the board meeting, that board meeting. I didn't respond immediately. Not to create tension, but because I wanted to see where he would go without me guiding the conversation. He continued. He said he wondered whether things had been framed fairly, whether responsibility had been communicated clearly, whether he had been too quick to let certain assumptions stand. He didn't apologize. Not explicitly. He didn't accuse himself either. He was testing the ground, so I answered calmly. I said I'd also thought about it. I understood why the narrative had formed the way it did. That pressure compresses complexity. Those rooms like that prefer clean stories. I didn't say he was wrong. I said the system rewarded convenience. There was another pause, longer this time. Then he asked the question he had actually called to ask. Do you think we blamed the wrong thing? I could have corrected the record then. Laid out the documentation, walked him through timelines and approvals. I had everything. I still did, but that wouldn't have been a confrontation. That would have been an explanation. An explanation would have put me back in the same role, translating reality so someone else could sit comfortably with it. So instead, I said something simpler. I said, I think the system needed a place for accountability to land, and I was available. He didn't interrupt. He didn't disagree. He asked if I felt wronged. That question mattered, because it wasn't about facts anymore. It was about emotion, about whether I was carrying resentment, whether this conversation needed resolution or repair. I told him the truth. I said I didn't feel angry, that I didn't feel betrayed, that what happened made sense inside the structure we were operating in. And that understanding had been more useful to me than any apology would have been. He seemed relieved by that, but also unsettled. He said quietly, I wish you'd said something sooner. I let that sit. Then I said, just as quietly, I did. In the ways that were available to me. I didn't elaborate. I didn't need to, because by then, he knew. He mentioned that leadership had revisited old decisions, that they'd realized how often risks had been flagged, but not escalated, that certain narratives had been overly simplified. Again, no apology, no admission, just acknowledgement. And acknowledgement, in that moment, was enough. Not because it fixed the past, but because it confirmed that my silence had not been misread forever. It had simply taken time for the system to hear what it wasn't ready to hear earlier. Before we ended the call, he asked if there was anything he could have done differently. I chose my words carefully. I said, "When someone is quiet and consistent, it's easy to assume they'll always be there to absorb things. Sometimes the most helpful thing a leader can do is ask what that silence is costing." He thanked me. And that was it. No reconciliation, no closure ritual, no dramatic turning point, just two people acknowledging a truth that no longer needed to be acted on. When the call ended, I didn't feel triumphant. I didn't feel vindicated. I felt light, because the confrontation hadn't been about winning or losing. It had been about confirming something I already knew, that my quiet had not been weakness, and my departure had not been accidental. It had been a boundary, and boundaries, once drawn, don't need to be defended again. I don't think of myself as someone who won anything. What changed wasn't my status or my confidence in some dramatic way. What changed was my relationship with silence, with responsibility, and with how I allow myself to be positioned. In my current role, people still describe me as calm, measured, thoughtful. Those traits didn't disappear, but they land differently now. When I'm quiet, it's assumed I'm thinking, not disengaged. When I speak, it's understood that I own what I'm influencing. That alignment matters more than I ever realized. I no longer confuse being agreeable with being professional. I no longer believe that absorbing discomfort is the same as being mature. And I don't assume that clarity will protect itself. What I learned, slowly, uncomfortably, is that systems don't reward truth by default. They reward what keeps them moving. And if you are the person who makes movement easier, you also become the person they lean on when things break. Now, I choose where I apply that effort. I'm more explicit about boundaries, not rigid, but ask early who makes decisions and how risk is being handled, Deled. Not because I distrust people, but because ambiguity has a cost, and someone always pays it. I also don't rush to fill the silence anymore. Silence can be an invitation. It can reveal who feels responsible, who feels exposed, and who expects someone else to step in. Letting that play out has taught me more than speaking ever did. There's no bitterness in this. I don't carry resentment toward the people who stayed silent in that room, or the manager who let the narrative stand. I understand how pressure works. I understand how quickly systems choose convenience over accuracy. Understanding doesn't mean repeating the pattern. If anything, I feel grateful for the clarity, for the timing, for the fact that the lesson arrived before I built my entire identity around being invisible. I still take pride in doing good work. I still care about outcomes. But I no longer attach my worth to being indispensable in ways that erase me. I'm present now, not louder, just clearer, and that has made all the difference. When I look back on that board meeting now, it doesn't stand out as a betrayal or a failure. It stands out as a moment of truth, not about anyone else, but about how systems work, and how easily we can be shaped by them without realizing it. The hardest part wasn't being blamed. It was recognizing how ready I had been to carry that blame quietly. Not because I believed it was fair, but because I believed it was expected. Many workplaces reward the people who smooth things over, who translates confusion into progress, those who absorb risk so others can move fast. Those people often think they're being responsible, mature, team-oriented, and they are until the cost becomes invisible. The lesson I took from all of this isn't speak louder or defend yourself aggressively. It's more precise than that. Clarity is not confrontation. Boundaries are not hostile, and silence is only powerful when it's chosen. If you find yourself constantly explaining decisions you didn't make, outcomes you didn't control, or failures you only advised against, that's not bad luck. That's positioning. And positioning can be changed, but rarely from inside the moment when the blame lands. Sometimes the most honest thing you can do is stop correcting the story and instead step out of it entirely. Not to punish anyone, not to prove anything, but to realign yourself with a version of truth that doesn't require constant defense. I didn't get an apology that mattered. I didn't get public vindication, and I didn't need either. What I got was distance, clarity, and a life where my calm is read correctly, not as weakness, but as judgment. So I'll leave you with one question, one that matters more than any moral I could spell out. If you stopped absorbing what isn't yours, what would finally become visible in your life? If this story resonated with you, I'd really like to hear your thoughts in the comments.